The bruise on her jaw wasn't just a mark. It was a death sentence for whoever put it there. Roman didn't care about many things. He ran a city built on broken bones and dirty money, and empathy was a luxury he couldn't afford. But seeing her bleed in his office shifted something cold and violent inside him. He asked her one question. Her quiet answer didn't just change his night. It started a war. The grandfather clock in the corner of Roman's office didn't tick. It thumped, heavy, rhythmic, like a tired heart dragging itself through another miserable night in the city. Roman sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of dark walnut, staring at a stack of papers that represented 6 months of agonizing restraint. The Moretti Treaty. 30 pages of territorial divides, profit margins, and union control. It was designed to stop the bleeding. The streets had been running red since the spring, and bad press was bad for business. Peace was a compromise. Roman hated compromise. He hated Vincent Moretti even more. He rubbed his thumb against his temple, feeling the dull ache of a migraine setting in. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rain was relentless, turning the city skyline into a smeared canvas of neon and concrete. He reached for the crystal tumbler on his desk, the amber liquid inside catching the dim light of the reading lamp. He took a slow drink. It tasted like ash and expensive wood. A sharp knock broke the silence. Roman didn't look up. "I told you to clear the floor, Paulie." The heavy oak door creaked open anyway. Paulie stood in the frame. He was a man shaped like a cinder block, a veteran of 2 syndicate wars, and a man who hadn't blinked at the sight of a severed head in a cardboard box. But right now, Paulie looked distinctly uncomfortable. His massive shoulders were hunched, his hands awkwardly hovering near his waist. "I know, boss," Paulie said. His voice was a gravelly rasp. But she wouldn't let it go, showed up at the front gate. The guards didn't know what to do. Neither did I, to be honest. Roman frowned, finally setting his pen down. "Who?" "Nora," Paulie muttered, stepping aside just enough to let the light from the hallway spill into the dark office. Roman went entirely still. The name didn't belong in this building. It didn't belong on this side of the city. Nora ran a small, struggling bakery 3 blocks from the old neighborhood where Roman grew up. It was a dusty, fluor-coated relic that smelled of yeast, burnt sugar, and stubborn survival. Roman went there every Sunday morning at 7:30. He sat in the back booth. He drank black coffee. He left a crisp $100 bill under the saucer. They rarely spoke more than 10 words to each other. She was a civilian, a quiet, tired woman with flour perpetually dusted on her forearms, keeping her head down in a neighborhood that chewed people up. She was his only anchor to a world that didn't involve extortion and shallow graves. "Bring her in," Roman said, his voice dropping an octave. Paulie stepped fully into the room, gently pulling someone by the arm. Nora stepped over the threshold. The sight of her hit Roman like a physical blow to the ribs, knocking the air out of his lungs in a sharp, painful rush. She was soaked to the bone. Her oversized trench coat was plastered to her narrow frame, dripping muddy water onto the Persian rug. But it wasn't the rain that made Roman's stomach turn to lead. It was her face. Her lower lip was split open, the blood drying in a dark, rusty streak down her chin. The left side of her jaw was heavily discolored, a violent mosaic of purple and black swelling rapidly under the harsh office lights. She was trembling. Not just a slight shiver, but deep, bone-rattling tremors that she was desperately trying to suppress by wrapping her arms around her stomach. Roman didn't say a word. He didn't gasp. He didn't ask what happened. He just stood up. The heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Paulie immediately backed up 2 steps. He knew that silence. Every man in Roman's crew knew that silence. It was the silence right before a building burned down. Nora looked up at him. Her good eye was wide, bright with unshed tears and a deep, humiliating exhaustion. She didn't look like a woman seeking justice. She looked like an animal that had dragged itself to the only warm place it knew before it died. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Her voice cracked, rough and broken. "I didn't know where else to go. The police wouldn't listen." "Paulie," Roman said. His tone was perfectly flat. "Dead. Get out. Shut the door. Nobody comes up here, not even if the building is on fire." "Yes, boss." Paulie retreated, pulling the heavy door shut with a soft click. The silence rushed back in, thicker this time. Suffocating. Roman slowly walked around the desk. He didn't rush. Rushing would panic her. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a predator trying to appear harmless. He stopped 3 feet away from her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets so she wouldn't see the knuckles turning stark white. "You're bleeding," he said quietly. Nora let out a breath that was half sob, half laugh. "I know." "Sit down," he pointed to the leather sofa against the far wall. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the opulent office, the mahogany, the silk, the leather. She looked down at her muddy boots, then at the pristine rug. "I'll ruin it." "Nora!" Roman's voice softened, just a fraction. "Fuck the rug. Sit down." She stumbled toward the sofa and collapsed into it. She looked incredibly small against the heavy furniture. Roman walked past her and headed straight for the ensuite bathroom attached to his office. He bypassed the luxury cologne and the designer towels, pulling a heavy, industrial-grade first aid kit from the bottom cabinet. When he returned, Nora had curled her knees to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. She was staring at the wall, her breathing shallow and ragged. Roman pulled a wooden chair up to the sofa and sat directly in front of her. He popped the latches on the kit. The sharp, sterile smell of iodine and rubbing alcohol cut through the smell of stale scotch and old paper. He didn't ask her any questions, not yet. Questions demanded energy, and she clearly had none left. He needed the facts, but first he needed to stop the bleeding. "Look at me," Roman instructed, his voice low. Nora turned her head. She flinched as the movement pulled at the bruised muscles in her neck. Roman soaked a cotton pad in antiseptic. "This is going to burn. Don't move." He reached out. His hands were large, calloused from years of street fights and trigger guards, but his touch was shockingly light. He cupped the uninjured side of her face to hold her steady. Her skin was freezing. When the alcohol touched her split lip, Nora hissed, her hands flying up to grip his wrist. Her fingers were icy, digging into his skin. Roman stopped. He didn't pull away. He just waited, letting her hold his wrist until her breathing leveled out. "Breathe," he murmured, his thumb lightly brushing her cheekbone, just under the swollen flesh. "Just breathe. I'm almost done." She squeezed her eyes shut and nodded. She didn't let go of his wrist. He went back to work, dabbing the crusted blood away from her mouth and chin. He examined the bruise on her jaw. The swelling was severe, but the bone underneath felt intact. It wasn't a slap. It was a closed fist, a heavy one. Anger, cold and pure, began to crystallize in his chest. It wasn't the hot, messy rage of his youth. It was an old, familiar ice, the kind that made him methodical, the kind that made him dangerous. "Your teeth?" he asked. "They're fine," she mumbled, the words slightly slurred from the swelling. "A little loose, but fine." Roman tossed the bloody cotton pad onto a towel and pulled out a small penlight. "Open your eye, the bad one." She forced it open. Roman clicked the light on, shining it briefly into her pupil. It dilated normally. No concussion. Or at least, not a severe one. He clicked the light off and tossed it back into the kit. He finally pulled away from her, letting his hands fall to his lap. The physical distance seemed to make the tension in the room spike. Nora uncurled her legs, planting her muddy boots firmly on the floor. She stared at her lap, her trembling hands knotted together. "You shouldn't be here," Roman said. It wasn't a reprimand. It was a statement of fact. His world was a contagion. She was supposed to be immune to it. She was supposed to stay in her flour-dusted bakery and sell stale bread to tired commuters. "I know," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm sorry, I didn't have anywhere else. I know what you do. I know who you are." Roman leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "If you know who I am, you know I don't run a charity ward." It was a cruel thing to say, but he needed to ground the situation. He needed to pull her out of the shock and into reality. He needed the truth. Nora blinked, looking up at him. The vulnerability in her eyes hardened just a fraction. Good. Anger was better than fear. "I don't want your charity," she said softly, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her attempt at defiance. "I want to close the shop. I need to break the lease." Roman narrowed his eyes. He owned the building her bakery was in. He owned the whole block. It was neutral territory, off limits to his men, off limits to the rivals, a quiet zone. "You're breaking your lease because someone punched you?" Roman asked, his tone deceptively casual. "I'm breaking my lease because they said they'd burn the building down with me inside it next time," she replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself. "They wanted protection money. I told them I already pay my rent to the holding company. They said the holding company doesn't run the streets anymore." Roman's jaw tightened. The holding company was his front. Whoever hit her knew exactly who they were insulting. "How many were there?" he asked. "3. "Did they take money?" "They emptied the register. It was barely $200. Nora let out a bitter, exhausted sigh. "They smashed the display cases. They poured bleach into the flour bins. They didn't just rob me, Roman. They broke my livelihood, just for fun, because they could." Roman processed the information coldly. 3 men, extorting a neutral zone, vandalism, assault. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, bringing his face closer to hers. The air between them felt charged, heavy with the impending weight of his next question. "I need you to think very carefully about what you say next, Nora," Roman said. His voice was no longer the soft murmur he used while cleaning her wounds. It was the voice of the man who ran the city, cold, absolute. Because once you say a name in this room, you don't get to take it back, and I don't give second chances. Nora swallowed hard. She looked at his eyes. They were dark, unreadable, utterly devoid of the quiet patron who drank coffee on Sunday mornings. She was looking at the devil, and she knew it. "Who did this to you?" he asked. The silence stretched, thin and brittle, snapping only when the grandfather clock let out another heavy thud. Nora looked down at her hands, then back up at him. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Her quiet answer changed his entire night. "The one with the scar," she whispered. "He laughed when he hit me. The other two called him Vincent." Vincent. Vincent Moretti. Roman didn't move. He didn't blink. The name hung in the air between them, like the smell of a gas leak. For the last 6 months, Roman had bent backward to broker a truce with the Moretti family. He had swallowed his pride, ignored the minor slights, and negotiated territory lines to prevent a full-scale bloodbath that would have brought the feds down on all of them. Vincent Moretti, the youngest brother of the rival boss, was a notorious loose cannon, a sadist with a god complex. But he was supposed to be leashed. The treaty, the very paper sitting on Roman's desk right now, was built on the promise that Vincent would stay in his lane. He hadn't just crossed the lane. He had driven a tank through it, parked it in Roman's neutral zone, and put his hands on the only piece of civilian life Roman cared about. Roman slowly stood up. He walked over to his desk. He didn't look back at Nora. He couldn't. If he looked at her bruised face right now, he would lose the cold, calculated grip on his sanity that he needed for the next 10 minutes. He picked up the stack of papers, 30 pages of delicate, multi-million-dollar negotiations. He gripped the edges and tore them in half. The thick parchment ripped with a loud, satisfying screech. He tore them again, dropping the shredded remains into the heavy brass trash can beside his desk. Nora watched him from the sofa, her eyes wide. "What are you doing?" "Housekeeping," Roman said flatly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed a single number. It rang twice. "Yeah, boss," Paulie answered. "Call the captains," Roman said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "All of them. Tell them to meet at the warehouse on 9th. We're going to work." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Boss, the ink ain't even dry on the treaty." "The treaty is dead, Paulie. They got 50 guys stationed near the docks right now. If we hit them without warning—" "I don't care if they have the National Guard," Roman snarled, the ice finally cracking, revealing the absolute inferno beneath. "Vincent stepped into the South Side tonight. He hit a civilian. He trashed my property. You tell the men to gear up. Any Moretti guy breathing on our side of the river doesn't get to walk back over it. Am I clear?" "Crystal, boss. It's done." Roman hung up. He tossed the phone onto the desk. The room was quiet again, save for the steady drumming of the rain against the glass. The city out there was asleep, unaware that its streets were about to turn into a war zone. He turned back to Nora. She was staring at him, the reality of what she had just catalyzed dawning on her face. She had asked to break a lease. She had just triggered a syndicate war. "I didn't—" She swallowed, her voice trembling again. "I didn't want anyone to die. I just wanted to leave." Roman walked back to her. He knelt in front of the sofa, forcing her to look him in the eye. "Listen to me," he said, his tone firm, demanding her complete attention. "You didn't do this. Vincent did this. He knew exactly whose neighborhood he was in. He knew exactly whose bakery he was trashing. This wasn't a robbery. It was a message. A message for what? She asked, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean line through the dried blood on her cheek. To see if I would bite, Roman said softly. He reached up, his thumb wiping the tear away with surprising gentleness. He wanted to know if I had gone soft. He wanted to see what I would tolerate for the sake of peace. He stood up, his jaw set, his eyes dark and resolute. I'm going to put you in one of the guest suites on the top floor, Roman said, stepping back into the role of the general. There are guards at every door. You stay there. You don't leave the room. You don't answer the phone. If you need anything, you ask Polly. Nora stood up slowly, her knees buckling slightly. Roman caught her by the elbow, steadying her. Where are you going? She asked, her fingers loosely gripping the sleeve of his tailored shirt. Roman looked down at her hand, then up at her bruised, battered face. The anger inside him surged again, hot and blinding. I'm going to deliver my reply, Roman said. He let go of her arm, walked to the heavy oak door, and pulled it open. The noise of the syndicate waking up, the shouting, the racking of slides, the heavy boots on marble floors, drifted up from the lower levels. Roman Navarro was going to war, and the city would burn before the sun came up. The rain turned to sleet by 2:00 a.m. It fell in hard, freezing sheets against the windshield of the armored SUV, blurring the streetlights into smeared yellow halos. Roman sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead. He didn't check his weapon. He had checked it 3 times in the elevator. A customized .45 caliber 1911. Heavy, dependable. The cold steel felt familiar against his thigh. Behind him, 3 more SUVs rolled in a tight, silent convoy. No headlights, no radio chatter. Just the low hum of heavy engines cutting through the deserted industrial district. 3 minutes out, Paulie said, from behind the wheel. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of its usual casual warmth. Paulie in a suit was a businessman. Paulie in a tactical vest was a butcher. Keep the perimeter tight, Roman replied, not taking his eyes off the road. Nobody gets out of the yard. If they run for the water, let the current have them. Vincent? If he's there, shoot him in the kneecaps. I want him breathing when I get to him. The convoy took a sharp left, the tires hissing over wet asphalt, and pulled into an abandoned shipping yard. Rusting containers were stacked like rotting monoliths in the dark. At the far end, a massive corrugated steel warehouse sat near the water's edge. This was Vincent Moretti's pride and joy, a hub for untaxed liquor, stolen electronics, and whatever else the younger Moretti felt like fencing that week. It was technically sanctioned by the treaty. Not anymore. The SUVs stopped. The doors opened in unison. 30 men stepped out into the freezing sleet. There was no shouting, no rallying cry. They moved with the grim, mechanical efficiency of men who clocked in for the graveyard shift. Roman led the charge. The gravel crunched under his boots. The cold air burned his lungs, but the ice in his veins was colder. He approached the side door of the warehouse. 2 guards were stationed outside, huddled beneath a rusted awning, smoking cigarettes and complaining about the weather. They didn't hear the footsteps over the wind. Paulie stepped out from the shadow of a shipping container, raising a suppressed pistol. 2 quiet, rhythmic thwips. The guards dropped like cut strings, their cigarettes fizzling out in the icy puddles. Roman didn't even break his stride. He stepped over the bodies, grabbed the heavy iron handle of the door, and kicked it open. The inside of the warehouse was a cavern of harsh halogen lights and the smell of stale beer and diesel fuel. About 20 of Vincent's men were scattered around, playing cards on wooden crates or loading pallets. The sudden crash of the door made them freeze. For 2 seconds, absolute silence hung in the massive space. Then, Roman raised his gun. "Burn it down!" The warehouse erupted. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. Roman's men flooded through the doors like a tidal wave of black Kevlar and muzzle flashes. The deafening roar of gunfire swallowed the screams. Wood splintered. Glass shattered. The air filled with a thick, choking cloud of concrete dust and cordite. Roman walked through the chaos at a measured pace. He didn't run. He didn't take cover. He shot with terrifying robotic precision. A man with a shotgun popped up from behind a forklift. Roman put 2 rounds in his chest before the man could pump the action. Another tried to run for the loading dock doors. Roman dropped him with a single shot to the spine. He checked the office. He checked the catwalks. Vincent wasn't there. The gunfire tapered off, replaced by the groans of the dying and the heavy breathing of Roman's crew. The air was blue with smoke. "Boss!" Paulie called out, wiping a splatter of blood off his cheek. "It's clear. No sign of the kid." Roman holstered his weapon. The disappointment tasted like copper in his mouth. He looked around the warehouse. Millions of dollars in contraband, sitting in neat little piles. "Douse it," Roman commanded. His men grabbed jerry cans of diesel fuel from the corner and began sloshing them over the crates, the electronics, the bodies. Roman walked over to the supervisor's desk in the center of the room. A cheap plastic phone sat next to a ledger. He picked up the ledger, flipped through it to ensure it was Vincent's handwriting, and tossed it onto a puddle of fuel. "Paulie," Roman said, his voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. "Find the one breathing the heaviest. Drag him over here." Paulie hauled a bleeding Moretti soldier over to the desk. The man was clutching a gut wound, his face pale and slick with sweat. He looked up at Roman with pure, unadulterated terror. Roman crouched down so he was eye level with the man. "You know who I am?" Roman asked softly. The man nodded frantically, coughing up a spatter of blood. "Navarro, Roman Navarro. Good. You're going to the hospital tonight. When you wake up, you're going to call Thomas Moretti. You tell him his brother crossed the river. You tell him the treaty is dead. And you tell him that every building with his family's name on it is going to look exactly like this by Friday." Roman stood up. He pulled a silver Zippo lighter from his coat pocket. He flicked it open. The small flame danced violently in the drafty warehouse. He dropped it onto the fuel-soaked ledger. The fire caught instantly. A whoosh of heat and bright orange light rushing across the floor, climbing the wooden crates, hungrily devouring the warehouse. Roman turned his back on the flames and walked out into the freezing rain. It was a start, but it wasn't enough. The silence in the penthouse was heavier than the noise of the streets. Nora sat on the edge of a king-sized bed, wrapped in a silk duvet that probably cost more than a year of her bakery's rent. The room was massive, decorated in stark, minimalist shades of gray and charcoal. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city. From up here, the dirt and the grime were invisible. The city looked like a glittering circuit board, beautiful and detached. She couldn't stop shivering. She had washed her face in the marble bathroom. The hot water had stung her cuts, bringing fresh tears to her eyes. The bruise on her jaw had darkened to an ugly, mottled purple. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. She looked like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She walked over to the window, wrapping her arms around her chest. The rain was beating against the thick, soundproof glass. Far off in the distance, near the industrial district, a faint orange glow pulsed against the low-hanging clouds. Sirens wailed, tiny and insignificant from 30 stories up. Nora pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She closed her eyes. They poured bleach into the flour. It was a small detail, but it was the one that broke her heart the most. The register could be replaced. The glass could be swept up. But the flour was her livelihood. It was her grandmother's sourdough starter, the morning spent kneading dough before the sun came up. The quiet pride of creating something good in a neighborhood that was fundamentally bad. They hadn't just destroyed a business. They had destroyed her sanctuary. And now she was in another one. Roman's sanctuary. She didn't know what terrified her more. The men who had beaten her, or the man who had gone to avenge her. Roman Navarro wasn't a hero. He was a monster. He extorted. He controlled. He killed. She had always known this, even when she served him coffee on Sunday mornings. She had willfully ignored the shadows that clung to him because he tipped well and never caused trouble. Now she had unleashed him. The electronic lock on the front door of the suite clicked. Heavy footsteps moved through the foyer. Nora turned, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stayed by the window, the silk duvet clutched tightly around her shoulders. Roman walked into the living area. He stopped when he saw her. The adrenaline had bled out of him, leaving a hollow, exhausting fatigue in its wake. His tailored wool coat was soaked through, heavy with icy rain. His knuckles were bruised, and a thin smear of blood, not his own, streaked across his left jawline. He smelled like ash, wet dog, and copper. He didn't say a word. He shrugged off the ruined coat and let it drop to the pristine hardwood floor. He walked to the leather armchair in the center of the room and sank into it, resting his elbows on his knees and burying his face in his hands. Nora watched him. The sheer, overwhelming power of the man was gone. He looked entirely human. He looked broken. She slowly released the duvet, letting it fall to the floor. She was wearing a pair of sweatpants and a clean t-shirt she had found in the dresser. She walked into the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound on the floorboards. She filled a glass with water from the tap, pulled a clean dish towel from the drawer, and ran it under warm water. She walked back into the living room and stood in front of him. Roman didn't look up. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "Roman," she said softly. He flinched at the sound of his name. He lifted his head. His eyes were bloodshot, dark with a violence that hadn't fully faded. He looked at the glass of water in her hand, then at the warm towel. "I'm dirty," he rasped. "Don't." "I'm dirty too," Nora said quietly. She knelt in front of his chair. It was a mirror image of how they had been positioned in his office, only the roles were reversed. She offered him the glass of water. Roman stared at it for a long moment before taking it. His hand was trembling slightly. He downed the water in one long gulp and set the glass on the floor. Nora leaned forward and gently pressed the warm, damp towel against his jawline, wiping away the streak of blood. He closed his eyes, leaning into the touch ever so slightly. The heat of the towel seemed to draw a long, shuddering breath out of his chest. "Did you find him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Roman said, opening his eyes. They locked onto hers. The proximity was suffocating. "But I found his crew. I left a message." "A loud one?" "The loudest." Nora swallowed. "Will it stop him?" "No," Roman said honestly. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't offer her hollow reassurances. "It's going to make him worse. It's going to make his brother get involved. The city is going to bleed for a few weeks, Nora." "Because of me," she said, looking down at her hands. Roman grabbed her chin, not hard, but firmly. He forced her to look back up at him. "Never say that," he commanded, his voice finding its steel again. "Do you understand me? You are not responsible for the evil men, just because you happened to be standing in their way." Vincent made a choice. I made a choice. You just survived. That's all you have to do now. Survive. Nora stared at him, the bruised, battered face of the baker meeting the cold, exhausted eyes of the kingpin. In that quiet, sterile penthouse, isolated from the burning city below, a very strange, very dangerous bond began to cement itself. It wasn't romance. It was a mutual recognition of survival. "I can't stay here forever," she whispered. "Watch me make you," he replied. The morning sun did not bring warmth. It only illuminated the wreckage. By 8 a.m., the news was broadcasting aerial footage of the smoldering remains of the waterfront warehouse. The anchors called it an industrial accident. The police commissioner called it a tragic electrical fire. Everyone in the underworld knew it was an act of war. Roman stood at the kitchen island of the penthouse, wearing a fresh white shirt and gray slacks, drinking his third cup of black coffee. His cell phone sat on the marble countertop. It had been vibrating constantly for 2 hours. He had ignored all of them. He was waiting for one specific call. At 8:15 a.m., the phone rang. A blocked number. Roman set his mug down and answered it, putting it on speaker. "Thomas," Roman said. His voice was casual, almost polite. "You burned my property, Roman." Thomas Moretti's voice crackled through the speaker. It was a deep, aristocratic voice. Thomas liked to pretend he was a legitimate businessman. He liked golf and expensive art. But underneath the veneer, he was just as ruthless as his little brother. 32 men dead, 5 million in product turned to ash. We had an agreement. "We did," Roman agreed, leaning against the counter. "Then your rabid dog of a brother wandered off his leash. He came into the South Side last night. He put his hands on a civilian under my protection. He trashed her property." There was a heavy pause on the line. Thomas wasn't an idiot. He was calculating the variables. "Vincent is impulsive," Thomas said finally, the strain evident in his voice. He felt the territory lines were restrictive. He wanted to test the waters. It was a mistake. We can make reparations. I'll cover the damages to the civilian's property, triple the cost. We sit down, we redraw the waterfront lines, and we put this behind us. Roman let out a short, hollow laugh. You think this is about money, Tommy? Everything is about money, Roman. Not this. Your brother hit a woman. He spit on my neighborhood. There are no reparations. The treaty is gone. Roman, be reasonable, Thomas warned, his aristocratic tone slipping into something much darker. You go to war with us. It's going to cost you heavily. The commission won't stand for it. The feds will use the RICO Act on all of us. You're going to burn down the entire city over a battered baker? Yes, Roman said simply. Silence hung on the line. What do you want? Thomas asked, realizing negotiation was failing. I want Vincent, Roman said. You hand him over to me by midnight tonight. Alone. No guards. If you do that, the rest of your operation survives. You keep your territory. But Vincent doesn't get to breathe my air anymore. He's my blood, Roman. I can't do that. Then buy a lot of coffins, Thomas, because I'm coming for everyone. Roman ended the call. He didn't throw the phone. He didn't curse. He just picked up his coffee mug and took another sip. The board was set. The pieces were moving. He turned around and stopped. Nora was standing in the doorway of the kitchen. She looked better this morning, though the bruise on her jaw was now a spectacular shade of deep violet. She was wearing his oversized sweatshirt, her arms crossed tight against her chest. How much of that did you hear? Roman asked, setting the mug down. Enough, she said, her voice steady. She walked into the kitchen, maintaining a safe distance from him. You're really going to war. I am already at war. Over me. Roman sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. We went over this last night, Nora. It's about respect. It's about boundaries. Don't lie to me, she snapped, a sudden flash of anger cutting through her fear. Don't treat me like one of your soldiers, Roman. I know how your world works. If this was just about a trashed storefront, you would have demanded a tax. You would have taken money. You don't burn down a warehouse and declare a blood feud over a bakery. Roman stared at her. Her defiance was startling. Most people cowered when he raised his voice, let alone when he started a syndicate war. But Nora was looking at him with a fierce, demanding clarity. He walked slowly around the kitchen island, closing the distance between them. She didn't back away. You're right, he said softly, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. I don't start wars over buildings. I don't care about the flour, or the register, or the broken glass. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her bruised face. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I care that he touched you, Roman admitted, the words tasting like poison and truth. I care that the only quiet, decent thing I had left in my life was bleeding on my rug. Vincent took something from me. I'm going to take everything from him. Nora's breath hitched. The reality of his obsession, his possessive, violent nature, crashed into her. It was terrifying. But deep down, beneath the layers of morality and fear, a tiny, cynical part of her felt a sudden, sharp thrill of safety. No one had ever fought for her. Not like this. Not with this level of apocalyptic dedication. I can't stay in this penthouse forever, she said, changing the subject, her voice trembling slightly. I have a life, or I had one. Your life is on pause, Roman said, his hand dropping back to his side. Thomas won't give Vincent up. Vincent will go underground, but not before he tries to strike back. You are his leverage. If he finds out you're alive, if he finds out you're here, He will come for you to get to me. So, I'm a prisoner. You're a guest, Roman corrected smoothly. A very protected guest. I need clothes. I need my toothbrush. I need my books, she listed, stepping back, trying to reclaim some semblance of control over her rapidly spiraling existence. Paulie will go to your apartment. Make him a list. Roman turned back to the counter, checking his phone as a new text came in. Get comfortable, Nora. We're going to be roommates for a while. He walked out of the kitchen, his mind already shifting gears back to the logistics of murder and territory. Nora watched him go, the oversized sweatshirt swallowing her small frame. She looked out the window at the morning traffic far below. She had gone to him to break a lease. Instead, she had signed a completely different kind of contract, and the ink was paid in blood. By the 5th day, the penthouse smelled like sourdough and violence. Nora couldn't sleep. The silence of the luxury suite was worse than the noise of her old neighborhood. Up here, the air was filtered, the temperature was perfectly regulated, and the danger was entirely invisible. To keep herself from losing her mind, she had asked Paulie for baking supplies. True to his word, the massive enforcer had returned with 50 pounds of artisan flour, fresh yeast, sea salt, and a set of professional mixing bowls. Now, the sprawling, state-of-the-art kitchen was dusted in white powder. Nora stood at the marble island, her hands deep in the dough, kneading with a rhythmic, punishing intensity. Push, fold, turn, push, fold, turn. It was a grounding mechanism. The tactile sensation of the dough, the sour, earthy smell of the yeast. It was the only proof she had that her former life wasn't just a hallucination. The front door chimed, followed by the heavy clunk of the deadbolt sliding back. Nora didn't stop kneading, but her shoulders tensed. She listened to the footsteps in the foyer. Slow, dragging, Roman rounded the corner into the kitchen. He stopped, leaning heavily against the door frame. He looked terrible. The pristine suits were gone, replaced by dark jeans and a black tactical sweater that smelled of stale smoke and ozone. His face was a canvas of exhaustion. Dark circles bruised the skin under his eyes, and a fresh cut snaked through his eyebrow, held together by a butterfly bandage. He didn't speak. He just watched her hands work the dough. "You're bleeding again," Nora said quietly, not looking up. "Glass," Roman muttered, his voice raspy. He walked over to one of the leather bar stools and dropped into it. He rested his elbows on the cool marble, wincing slightly as his ribs shifted. "One of Thomas's guys had a shotgun, took out the windshield of the SUV while we were moving. Spalled glass caught me." Nora stopped kneading. She wiped her hands on a towel, her eyes finally moving to his face. "Are you losing?" "No," Roman said flatly. "We're suffocating them. Thomas lost the docks on Tuesday. We took his distribution center in the Narrows last night. His men are defecting, but a cornered animal bites the hardest." He reached out, his long fingers trailing through a dusting of flour on the countertop. It was a remarkably gentle gesture for a man who had just spent the last 10 hours systematically dismantling a criminal empire. "It smells good in here," he said softly. Nora leaned against the counter opposite him. The fear that had paralyzed her on the first night was gone, replaced by a strange, numbing pragmatism. She had watched him leave every night, knowing he was going out to orchestrate murder, and she had waited for him to return every morning. The lines of morality were blurring, smudged by the undeniable fact that he was doing it for her. "Take your shirt off," Nora said. Roman blinked, looking up at her through heavy eyelids. "What?" "Your ribs," she pointed. "You winced when you sat down. Take it off. Let me look." He hesitated, a flicker of something guarded crossing his features. Then, wordlessly, he gripped the hem of the thick sweater and pulled it over his head. Nora sucked in a quiet breath. His torso was a map of old violence. Scars crisscrossed his pale skin, some thin and surgical, others jagged and angry. But it was the left side of his rib cage that demanded attention. A massive purpling bruise bloomed across his ribs, angry and swollen. She walked around the island. She didn't hesitate this time. She pressed her fingers gently against the darkest part of the bruise. Roman's jaw tightened, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth, but he didn't pull away. "Nothing is broken," she murmured, her thumb lightly tracing the edge of the swelling. "But it's going to hurt to breathe for a week." "I've had worse," he said. His voice was lower now, closer. Nora looked up. Their faces were inches apart. She could see the faint flecks of gold in his dark eyes, the exhaustion lining the corners of his mouth. For the first time, she realized how young he actually was. Underneath the terrifying reputation, underneath the money and the blood, he was just a man carrying the weight of a crumbling city. "Why did you do this, Roman?" she asked. It wasn't a question about the war. It was a question about them. "I was just the woman who poured your coffee. You could have handed me a check and told me to leave town. Why tear your whole world apart for me?" Roman didn't answer immediately. He looked down at her hands, still resting against his skin. He reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers. He didn't push it away. He just held it there. "Because my world was already torn apart," he said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "I sit in rooms with men who smile while they plan to slit my throat. I buy loyalty with fear. I sleep with a gun under my pillow. My life is a machine, Nora, and you were the only thing in it that was clean." He looked back into her eyes. The intensity there was stripped of all its usual armor. "When I saw you bleeding on my rug," he swallowed hard. It wasn't just Vincent crossing a line. It was him proving that nothing is safe. If I couldn't protect the one quiet, decent thing I had, then I didn't deserve to run this city. I didn't start this war over a bakery. I started it because he tried to take away my only proof that good things still exist. Nora's breath hitched. She pulled her hand back, suddenly overwhelmed by the raw, suffocating weight of his confession. She had wanted him to be a monster. It would have been easier to hate a monster. But he wasn't. He was a man dying of thirst who had decided to burn down the desert because someone kicked over his only glass of water. "You should sleep," she whispered, stepping back toward her dough. "I'll make you something to eat." Roman watched her retreat. He didn't push. He picked up his sweater. "Yeah, okay." He walked toward the master bedroom, his footsteps heavy and uneven. Nora watched his back until he disappeared around the corner. Then she buried her hands back in the dough, gripping it so hard her knuckles turned white. She wasn't a captive anymore. She was an accomplice. And the terrifying truth was, she didn't want to leave. Day 9 brought heavy rain and a finality that hung in the air like a guillotine. Roman was sitting at the dining table, disassembling his .45. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the quiet penthouse. He wiped down the slide with an oiled cloth, his movements practiced and robotic. Paulie stood near the window, his massive frame blocking the gray light. He was holding a burner phone, his face grim. "Are you sure?" Roman asked, snapping the barrel back into place. "It's confirmed, boss," Paulie rasped. Thomas reached out to the old man in the Lupertazzi family to mediate. He's cutting his losses. The commission told Thomas he's got 24 hours to hand Vincent over, or they greenlight you to wipe the entire Moretti family off the map. Thomas chose his empire over his blood. Roman racked the slide. The heavy clack was deafening. Where? An old auto salvage yard off Interstate 9. Thomas told Vincent it was a safe house, told him to wait there for a transport out of the city. He's isolated, 2 guards. That's it. Thomas is serving him up on a silver platter. When? He's there now, waiting. Roman stood up. He slammed a fresh magazine into the grip of the pistol and shoved it into his shoulder holster. He reached for his long, black overcoat draped over a chair. "Tell the men to stand down," Roman said, sliding his arms into the coat. "Call off the perimeter teams. I'm going alone." Paulie turned from the window, his brow furrowed. "Boss, that's stupid. It could be a double cross. Let me take a strike team. We sweep the yard, we flush him out." "No." Roman's voice brooked no argument. "Thomas isn't stupid enough to double-cross me now. His back is against the wall. This ends tonight, and it ends with me." Nora stood in the hallway, clutching a dish towel. She had heard the entire exchange. The cold, mechanical way they discussed a man's impending death sent a shiver down her spine. But when she thought of Vincent, the laughing face, the heavy fist, the bleach in the flour, the shiver turned into something harder, darker. Roman turned and saw her. He paused. He nodded at Paulie, a silent dismissal. Paulie walked past Nora without a word, letting himself out of the penthouse. Roman crossed the room, stopping a few feet away from her. The air between them felt thick, charged with the brutal reality of what he was about to do. "If this goes wrong," Roman said quietly, reaching into his inner pocket and pulling out a small, thick envelope. "Paulie has orders. He'll take you to a private airfield in Jersey. There's a plane waiting. This envelope has a new passport, banking details for an offshore account, and the deed to a commercial property in Seattle. It's enough to start over. 3 times over." Nora looked at the envelope. She didn't reach for it. "You're going to kill him." "Yes." "Are you going to come back?" Roman looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. "I intend to." "Then keep the envelope," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady. She stepped forward and pushed his hand back toward his chest. "I'm not running. Not anymore. You finish this, Roman. You finish it, and you come back." A muscle in his jaw feathered. He looked down at her hand, resting against his chest, right over his gun. Slowly, he reached up and cupped her face. His thumb brushed over the bruised skin on her jaw, which had faded to a dull, yellowish green. He leaned down and pressed his lips against her forehead. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a seal, a promise written in violence and survival. "Lock the door behind me," he whispered. He turned and walked out. The salvage yard was a labyrinth of rusted metal and shattered glass. The rain poured in sheets. turning the dirt into thick, sucking mud. Roman walked through the rows of crushed sedans and gutted trucks, his coat heavy with water. He didn't try to hide his approach. He wanted Vincent to know he was coming. At the center of the yard sat a dilapidated, single-story office building. Light spilled from a dirty window, cutting through the deluge. Roman drew his weapon. He kept it by his side, the muzzle pointed at the mud. Two men stood under the rusted awning of the office. Thomas's men. They saw Roman approach. They didn't raise their guns. They simply looked at each other, nodded, and walked away, disappearing into the dark maze of cars. Thomas had kept his word. The sacrifice was unguarded. Roman walked up the wooden steps. They groaned under his weight. He didn't bother checking the handle. He lifted his boot and kicked the door right next to the lock. The rotted wood splintered instantly, the door flying open and slamming against the interior wall. Vincent Moretti was sitting behind a cheap metal desk, a duffel bag at his feet. He jumped, scrambling backward, his chair tipping over. He was younger than Roman, handsome in a sleazy, arrogant way, but right now he looked like a terrified child. He clawed at his waistband, pulling a snub-nosed revolver. Roman didn't flinch. He raised his .45 in one fluid motion and fired. The shot was deafening in the small room. The bullet caught Vincent in the right shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the linoleum floor. Vincent screamed, collapsing against the back wall. He clutched his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with a frantic, pathetic panic. Roman walked slowly into the room. The rain blew in through the open doorway, chilling the stagnant air. "Roman, wait!" Vincent begged, pressing his good hand against the wall to push himself up. He was slipping in his own blood. Wait! Tommy said he fixed this. Tommy said it was handled." "Tommy sold you," Roman said. His voice was dead, flat, devoid of any theatrical anger. "He traded you for the docks." Vincent's face twisted in horror. No, he wouldn't do that. I'm his brother." "You're a liability," Roman corrected. He stopped 5 feet away. He looked down at the pathetic, bleeding man on the floor. He felt nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just the cold, mechanical necessity of taking out the trash. "I'll pay," Vincent sobbed, tears cutting through the grime on his face. "Whatever you want, I'll give you double." "I didn't know the bakery was yours. I swear to God, I didn't know." "You knew it was in my territory," Roman said, leveling the gun at Vincent's chest. "And you knew she couldn't fight back. You like breaking things that can't hit you back, Vincent? Let's see how you do against something that can." "Please, I'm sorry, Roman fired again. The bullet hit Vincent square in the chest. The impact threw him flat against the floor. He gasped, a wet, rattling sound, blood bubbling past his lips. Roman walked over and stood above him. He looked down into Vincent's fading, terrified eyes. "She said you laughed," Roman whispered. He aimed at Vincent's head. He pulled the trigger a third time. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the steady drum of the rain on the tin roof. Roman stared at the body for a long moment. He slowly lowered the gun. He engaged the safety and slid it back into its holster. He didn't feel lighter. He didn't feel cleansed. He just felt deeply, profoundly tired. He turned around and walked out into the rain. The debt was paid. The war was over. Now he had to figure out what was left. It was 3 a.m. when the deadbolt clicked. Nora was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the muted television. When the door opened, she stood up instantly, the blanket falling to the floor. Roman walked in. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck. He was soaked to the bone, his coat dripping muddy water onto the hardwood. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He kicked the door shut behind him with the heel of his boot. He looked at her. He didn't smile. He didn't say a word. Nora crossed the room. She didn't ask if it was done. She didn't need to. The total, crushing absence of tension in his posture told her everything. The monster was dead. "You're freezing," she said, reaching out to grasp the lapels of his ruined coat. She helped him shrug it off. He let her. He was remarkably pliant, as if the adrenaline crash had finally stripped him of all his defenses. She dropped the heavy wet wool onto the floor. "It's over," Roman said finally. His voice was a rasp, barely audible. "Thomas sent word on the drive back. The treaty is reinstated. The lines are redrawn." "And Vincent?" "Vincent isn't a problem anymore." Nora nodded slowly. The reality of it settled over her like a heavy quilt. The man who had terrorized her, who had laughed while destroying her life, was gone. Erased. And the man standing in front of her had done it. Roman stepped back, putting a deliberate distance between them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He set it on the foyer table. "What is that?" Nora asked. "Keys," Roman said. He refused to look at her now. He stared past her, out the window at the dark city. "I had Paulie buy a building in the North End. It's a prime retail space. Heavy foot traffic, neutral ground, completely safe. The kitchen is fully outfitted. Ovens, proofers, everything. It's in your name." Nora stared at the box. "I don't understand." "It's over, Nora," Roman said, his voice hardening, slipping back into the cold, detached cadence of the boss. "The threat is neutralized. You don't need to hide anymore. You can pack your things. Paulie will drive you there in the morning. You can go back to your life." He was giving her the out. He was pushing her away because the war was done, and he believed he was a contagion she needed to be cured of. He had burned the city down to keep her safe, and now he was trying to exile himself from her to keep her clean. Nora walked over to the table. She picked up the velvet box. It was heavy. Inside lay the brass keys to a brand new life, a safe life, a quiet life. She opened the box, looked at the keys for 5 seconds, and then snapped it shut. She turned around and tossed the box onto the couch. Roman frowned. "What are you doing?" "I'm not leaving," Nora said. "Nora, don't be stupid," Roman snapped, the exhaustion giving way to a sudden, sharp frustration. "This isn't a fairy tale. You saw what I am. You saw what I do. People around me die. My life is blood and paranoia. You don't belong here. You don't get to decide where I belong," she fired back, stepping into his space. She didn't flinch away from his anger. "You don't get to upend my entire existence, make me rely on you, bleed for me, and then dismiss me like one of your soldiers just because the shooting stopped." "I am trying to save you," he yelled, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "From what?" Nora yelled back. "From you? Roman? The men who beat me weren't you. The man who destroyed my life wasn't you. The civilian world didn't protect me. The police didn't protect me. You did." She reached out and grabbed the front of his shirt, pulling him down slightly so he was forced to look her in the eye. "I don't want a safe life in the North End," she whispered fiercely. "I want the man who tore up a treaty because someone put a hand on me. I want the man who comes home smelling like gunpowder and lets me patch his ribs." Roman stared at her, utterly disarmed. For all his power, for all his control, he had no defense against her. He had expected fear. He had expected disgust. He hadn't expected absolute, terrifying acceptance. "I will ruin you," he warned, his voice breaking, a desperate, final attempt to push her away to safety. "Try," Nora challenged. Roman let out a shattered breath. The last of his resistance crumbled. He reached down, wrapping his arms around her waist, and pulled her flush against him. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of vanilla, yeast, and soap. He held on to her like a drowning man clutching driftwood, his massive frame trembling slightly against hers. Nora wrapped her arms around his shoulders, her fingers threading into his damp hair. She held him back just as fiercely. They stood there in the quiet foyer, two broken pieces of a violent city fitting perfectly together. The war was over. The bruise on her jaw was fading. The blood on his hands was washed away, at least for tonight. They weren't good people anymore. The baker had learned to love the monster, and the monster had finally found a reason to be human. Outside, the rain finally stopped, and the sun began to bleed over the skyline. They had survived the night, and for Roman and Nora, that was the only victory that mattered. And that's how Roman and Nora survived the fallout. He burned down the city for her, and she chose to stay in the ashes with him. What did you think of Nora's final decision? Was she right to stay, or should she have taken the keys and run? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this gritty, dark romance, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow story lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, high-stakes dramas. Hit the bell so you never miss an upload. See you next time.